Velkommen tilbage fra pausen. Vores næste taler, Robert Hastings fra USA. Han er født i 1950 i New Mexico. Hans far var ansat i US Air Force og var i 1966 og 1967 med sin familie udstationeret ved Malmstrom Air Force Base, hvor Robert Hastings så også var med som teenager dengang. Og han havde et efterskolejob på Malmstrom Air Force Base i Montana, og var vidne til, at der blev registreret 5 UFO'er på radaren fra basens kontroltårn. Senere fandt han ud af, at de åbenbart havde manøvreret tæt ved et af de her atommissil-sites, som lå sydøst for basen. Og det var det, der i høj grad var med til at starte hans interesse for UFO-sagen. Han er uddannet fra Ohio University i 1972 og har blandt andet arbejdet som fototekniker på Northern Illinois University i cirka 8 år. I 1981 begyndte han at holde foredrag, efter han var begyndt at interviewe militærfolk, som har arbejdet med eller i nærheden af kernevåben, og som i den forbindelse har haft oplevelser med UFO'er. I dag har han interviewet over 130 personer, som han arbejdet nær missilbaser, våbenlager og prøvesprængningsområder. Han har holdt flere hundrede foredrag ved uddannelsesinstitutioner i USA. Så er han forfatteren til bogen UFOs and Nukes, som er blevet solgt her i dag. Han har været på CNN flere gange, blandt andet på Larry Kings talkshow, og talt om den her forbindelse mellem UFO'er og kernevåben. Velkommen til Robert Hastings.
Thank you. I think Frederick just covered some of the things I was going to say at the beginning. I will first say that I flew in from America a day before yesterday. I arrived yesterday, and I've had very little sleep in the last 2 nights. So if I suddenly nod off, someone slap me. My father was in the United States Air Force for 20 years. In 1966 and 67, our family was stationed, as it's called, at a base in Montana called Malmstrom Air Force Base, which is, even to this day, a nuclear missile base. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I will simply say that at the main Air Force tracking system, the radar building called the SAGE building, very huge concrete building, no windows, lots of radar. It was the most sophisticated radar in the world at that time, late 60s, computer assisted. It was designed to monitor if World War III had started, Soviet bombers coming over the North Pole, over the Arctic regions into Canada and the US. And radar picked up in the spring of 1967 unknown aerial objects maneuvering near nuclear missile sites, which are located many miles away from the base. They're widely separated. You have a central launch control facility underground controlling 10 different missiles, and all the missiles are connected by cable. Each of these launch control facilities controls 10 Minuteman nuclear missiles. And then again, they're scattered over several hundred square miles in Montana. The rumors that my father heard was that they were tracking these objects on radar at SAGE building, that they were maneuvering near the nuclear missile sites, hovering over the missile sites. I was in high school, secondary school, 16 years old, 17 years old, and 3 nights a week I worked at the base air traffic control tower. And over the course of many months, I was a janitor. I just pushed a broom and emptied trash cans, just an after-school job. And over many months, I became an acquaintance of one of the leading FAA, Federal Aviation Administration air traffic controllers. I cleaned this room every night, or 3 nights a week, where maybe perhaps a dozen radar screens were, these people monitoring air traffic control. And this one gentleman who was very kind with me, he answered my many questions. I was very curious about how radar worked. In the break room between, he would take a rest break, a lunch break, and he would talk to me about radar because I was very interested. And one night in late March, I've never been able to determine the exact date. I don't remember. I walked in to empty the trash cans and to sweep with my broom, and he just motioned me over to his screen, and said, you know, we're tracking 5 objects. I could see them on the screen with my own eyes. I don't know if he said UFOs or unidentifieds or unknown. All those terms are used by radar control people to describe what we call UFOs. But it was clear to me what he was talking about. And so I became very excited and started asking him questions, and he kind of backed up and went, oh, you know, I could tell from the look on his face that he was sorry that he had said that to me, because I was getting very excited. So he said, come back and clean the room later that evening, and I did. And when I brought it up again, I mentioned this to him, he didn't want to talk about it. And 3 days later, when I went back to the next time I was at the control tower, I brought it up to him again. A second time, he didn't want to talk about it. So I just let it ride. Then I went to college, to university, and in 1973, when I was 23, I became aware in a magazine article that the type of activity that I knew had gone on at Malmstrom, or was rumored had gone on at Malmstrom, had occurred at another Air Force base, and there was an article about this. So it became clear to me that what I witnessed in Montana was going on in North Dakota at another base. Within a year, there were 2 authors, a man named Donald Kehoe, another man named Raymond Fowler, who independently wrote books about UFO activity at missile sites at various Air Force bases. So by spring of 1973, I thought, this is real, this is important. Someone should start interviewing on tape, audio tape, people who were involved in these incidents. So I began doing that in 1973. Ex-radar people who worked on missiles as missile maintenance, missile targeting, even later on launch officers. At this point, I have interviewed over 140 Air Force personnel, now retired or they left the military, who were involved in incidents around the United States where UFOs would come in and hover over or fly around nuclear missile sites. As you'll hear, and I get into the documents section of my program, on some occasions, according to these missile launch officers, when these objects hover over the missiles malfunction. And I'll describe that in detail. But in 1981, I felt I had enough anecdotal evidence, testimony from these military people, to go on the U.S. college lecture circuit. And so I began speaking at universities, over 500 at this point in the United States. I've spoken at Oxford University in England. And what I'm doing is attempting to acquaint people with the reality of not only UFOs, what we call UFOs, but the fact that there's a very definite link between that phenomenon and nuclear weapons. And Tim Good talked about that as well earlier. What I'm going to show you as I speak are not photographs of UFOs or other subject matter, but the documents themselves. I am perfectly aware that reading documents on a screen is not exciting, is not meant to be exciting, but I'm going to make some dramatic statements, and I think it's important that I document what I say to you so you can see for yourself what the military and the intelligence community was secretly saying to each other in paper and documents, sending each other, you know, stories about flying saucers. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, public relations spokespeople were saying swamp gas, weather balloons, hoaxes, crazy people, liars, drunks. That's what they said people who saw UFOs were. Meanwhile, in reality, secretly, the US military, CIA, the National Security Agency, US State Department, other groups within my government were treating this deadly seriously. And they were aware very early on, as you're about to see, that whoever is flying these craft, wherever they're from, whatever this is all about, one thing that has gone on year after year, decade after decade, are activity, UFO activity at nuclear weapons sites. First slide, please. Now, this is not a document, this is an article from a very popular magazine in America called US News and World Report. It's very conservative. It's more or less affiliated with the Republican Party. They're very, very conservative in their writing and their editorials and so on. In the spring of 1977, shortly after President Jimmy Carter came to office, this column called Washington Whispers appeared. And you'll see, next slide please, in an enlargement, this is what they wrote. U.S. News predicted that before the end of 1977, information about UFOs that this magazine characterized as unsettling disclosures would be released by the CIA, basically confirming the reality of UFOs. Now, first of all, this was intriguing because officially the US government had told the American people year after year the only group within the government that investigated UFOs was the Air Force, and officially we were told that between 1947 and 1969 they found some percentage of UFO sighting reports that could not be attributed to natural phenomena or man-made aircraft. In other words, there was a residue of cases, a small number, that might be something unexplained. That's the official version of events. But the Air Force claimed in 1969 they found no evidence that these unknowns, this small number of unknowns, were a threat to US national security. Therefore, officially, the Air Force stopped investigating UFOs. What the public was not told by my government is that there were other groups within the Air Force that were always investigating UFOs besides Project Blue Book, the group that shut down in 1969, a group called OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, other counterintelligence and positive intelligence groups within the Air Force were collecting sighting reports and analyzing them. It is now further known that the CIA has been a major player in collecting and analyzing UFO data. And efforts were made in the late 70s, not even 2 years after that. Let's go back. Well, let's just hold there. Let's hold there. The efforts were made by CIA to suppress the fact that it was analyzing UFOs. But because of our law called the Freedom of Information Act, there was over 1,000 pages of documents successfully released to the public in late 1978 that proved that CIA was involved with collection and analyzing UFO data. So, what the public has been told is one thing, what has really gone on behind the scenes is another thing, and some of what you'll see today, this is just a very small, less than 1% of the documents that are available that talk about UFO activity at nuclear weapons sites. What you'll see is what the government in my country was actually talking to each other, the various agencies and departments, while the public was being told nonsense, don't worry about it, not real. This is what they were actually saying to themselves. This first document is an FBI memorandum. It was written in January of 1949. It was sent to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. It was written by the SAC, Special Agent in Charge of the San Antonio FBI office. The subject of the memo is, quote, protection of vital installations. Next slide, please. Now, I've blown up some of the key areas I'm covering into larger type so you can see it more easily. The first paragraph says that in the previous 2 weeks, various civilian and military intelligence groups within our government, my government, met to, quote, discuss the matter of unidentified aircraft or unidentified aerial phenomena, otherwise known as flying discs, flying saucers, and balls of fire. Whoever wrote this memo had underlined the last sentence in the first paragraph. It says, this matter is considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and the Air Forces. Next slide, please. Now why? Why would this matter of flying discs, flying saucers be considered top secret? This is the reason. In the last paragraph on that page, it says, during the past 2 months, various sightings of unexplained phenomena have been reported in the vicinity of the Atomic Energy Commission installation at Los Alamos, New Mexico, where these phenomena now appear to be concentrated. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the name Los Alamos, it was where nuclear weapons were invented. In 1945, something called the Manhattan Project successfully figured out how to use atomic energy in a way that a weapon could be created. We tested the first one in the deserts of New Mexico on July 16, 1945. It was successful. Not even 3 weeks later, 2 more were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. Those were all created, designed, and tested at Los Alamos. So this memo from 1949, some 4 years after these momentous world-shaking events, the invention of atomic weapons, the focal point for UFO activity in the United States, according to the FBI's own internal documentation, was the birthplace of nuclear weapons, Los Alamos. Next slide, please. I think we went ahead too, so I'm pretty sure we went ahead too, so that seems to be sort of tricky. If we can go back, if possible, if not, then. Okay.
Too much?
Yeah, let's go. Let's see if we can go back one more.
Yep.
In any case, no, go ahead one more. Okay, I thought I had an additional slide in there, so this is fine. This is an excerpt from a second FBI memorandum from August 23rd, 1950, some year and a half after the document I was showing you a moment ago. And this basically discusses unidentified aerial objects being sighted near not only Los Alamos, but a place called Sandia Base, where I was born, as a matter of fact, in 1950. The weapons were designed in Los Alamos. They were assembled and engineered down at Sandia Base in Albuquerque. Now, the body of this document says that the types of objects being reported around Los Alamos and Sandia Labs were of various types. The first type, quote, green fireballs, objects moving at high speed in shapes resembling half moons, circles, and disks emitting green light. Other Air Force and FBI documents confirm that as a result of these sightings, the Air Force secretly contracted a man named Dr. Lincoln La Paz of the University of New Mexico. He was a leading expert in the whole world on meteors, types of meteors, what science knew about meteors in the 1940s. Lincoln La Paz, we now know from other documents, was given the job, the task, for no pay, to work with the Air Force, to interview witnesses at Los Alamos and Sandia who had seen these green fireballs, to try to determine whether these were natural phenomena or something else. Dr. La Paz, many pages of a report that he sent to the Air Force summarizing his findings. He said that a number of the observers reported these objects performing maneuvers, so quite clearly they were not natural phenomena. He noted further that these green fireballs were sighted around northern New Mexico, the only place in the entire world where there were nuclear weapons at that time, and in West Texas, where there was a place called Killeen Base, which was one of the first places that nuclear weapons were stored, atomic weapons. They were designed at Los Alamos, they were put together at Sandia, and some of them were shipped to this Killeen Base. And there are other documents from my government, the Army, the Air Force, the FBI, talking about objects flying around Killeen Base in 1948, 1949. So Dr. La Paz said that if these were natural phenomena, naturally occurring meteors or meteorites, you would expect a random distribution of reports around the world. People would see them in Europe, people would see them in South America, but they were only concentrated around northern New Mexico and this one site in West Texas. Coupled with the fact that the observers, some observers were seeing these things change flight path, their direction of flight change. So he told, Dr. La Paz told the Air Force, these are artificial. They're either under intelligent control, someone's inside them flying them, or remote control. And he said that his best guess was that the Germans had technology that the Russians had captured at the end of World War II and were developing into these green fireball-like objects being sent to America to spy on the atomic weapons program. Dr. La Paz also said in his report that if that were not the case, if there was no evidence to support that hypothesis, then they could be a very high level, top secret American project that even the people at Los Alamos did not know about. Well, these reports were filed in the late 1940s, and even today there's no credible evidence, there are no additional documents, there are no former government scientists who've come forward and said, yes, these were our secret projects. There's no evidence from the former Soviet Union that these were Russian objects. So clearly we have artificial objects of unknown origin seemingly monitoring, or at least in the vicinity of the US nuclear weapons program from almost the very beginning of the program. Next slide, please. Halfway down this same FBI document from August 23rd, 1950, there's a second category of objects that are being reported around these atomic sites. And they are summarized as, quote, disks, round, flat-shaped objects or phenomena moving at fast velocity and emitting a brilliant white light or reflected light. In other words, flying disks, flying saucers, just what people all around America and the world, civilians, not military, not atomic scientists, were also reporting all over the country. And again, Pentagon spokespeople, if you look at what was reported in the media, when people saw UFOs, the Pentagon would say these are misidentifications of man-made or aircraft or natural phenomena or hoaxes, but they did not, you know, the PR, the public relations people at the Pentagon, they weren't cleared. They didn't have the secret clearances to know about this. So when they stand up and told the media there's nothing real about flying saucers, as far as they knew, that was the truth. But we now know from the Freedom of Information released documents decades later that quite clearly the military and the intelligence community not only accepted the reality of UFOs, but the fact that they seem to be an ongoing link with nuclear weapons sites was quite alarming to my government, of course, as you might imagine. We were the only country until August of 1949 when the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The US had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. And suddenly you have this unexpected development where craft of very obvious sophistication were seemingly expressing interest in our #1 national security secret. So, you know, the public was kept in the dark about this for many, many, many years to come, and yet it was going on. Now, Tim Good mentioned Roswell Army Airfield. That was the only base in the entire world in 1947 that had a bomber squadron capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Is it coincidental that this alleged crash, which I believe occurred, took place very near the world's only atomic base at that time? I believe it's not a coincidence, that there's a definite cause and effect. I think whatever this craft was in that area of New Mexico because of this bomber base. I'll say one more thing about Roswell later in the program, but let's go ahead now. Next slide. This particular FBI memorandum concludes by saying, quote, since 1948, approximately 150 observations of aerial phenomena referred to above have been recorded in the vicinity of atomic installations in New Mexico. So again, you know, what was developing behind the scenes and what the public was being told were day and night, two different things altogether. Next slide, please. Moving on to the decade of the 1970s. I now know from my interviews with these 140 Air Force veterans that UFO activity was occurring at bomber bases, atomic bomber bases, at missile sites, at test areas in Nevada and in the South Pacific where we were detonating hydrogen bombs. There are many veterans who were involved in these military operations involving the testing in Nevada and the South Pacific, who have said they were observing these objects and even seeing them flying around the mushroom clouds. Minutes after the detonations, there were radar trackings and visual observations by military pilots of unknown objects maneuvering near the mushroom clouds. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, were first deployed in the Soviet Union in 1957, very rudimentary, and in the United States 2 years later in 1959. And There are documents from the 1960s. I have witness testimony from nuclear missile personnel from the 1960s to indicate that what was going on in the 50s at these nuclear labs then also occurred at nuclear missile sites in Montana, in Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, where our nuclear missile bases are located. And what I'm going to share with you now are excerpts from an officially released Air Force letter containing logs from what is called NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Its job is to monitor American airspace and Canadian airspace with radar to make sure that no enemy aircraft, Russian aircraft, would penetrate American airspace. But because the whole continent was blanketed with these radars to make sure the Russians weren't going to sneak attack us, they were also picking up UFOs on a semi-regular basis. And so what you're reading in this Air Force letter that was released through the Freedom of Information Act, or NORAD, what are called NORAD Command Director's Logs. There are far too many entries in this 4-page letter for me to quote them all, but I would like to give you a sense of what was occurring the first week of November 1975 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. And so, next slide, please. These are the actual logs that NORAD recorded. The first entry: received a call from the 341st Strategic Air Command Post saying that the following missile locations reported seeing a large red to orange to yellow object. It then lists the missile sites by their coded designations, M1, etc. Next slide, please. So these are chronologically unfolding over a several-hour period. The next entry: SAC, Strategic Air Command, advised that the LCF, the Launch Control Facility at Harleton, Montana, observed an object which emitted a light which illuminated the site driveway. Next slide, please. The next entry from the same day, so just minutes later. SAC advised missile site K1 says very bright object to their east is now southeast of them, and they're looking at it with binoculars. Object seems to have lights, several on it, but no distinct pattern. The orange gold object overhead also has small lights on it. Next slide, please. The next entry that came in, missile site L1 reports that the object to their northeast seems to be issuing a black object from it, tubular in shape. In other words, a larger object released a smaller object, a satellite object, which was apparently like a tube or a cigar. And then it says, in all this time, surveillance, meaning radar, has not been able to detect any sort of track except for known traffic. In other words, you suddenly have a flurry of calls, several calls, one after the other, from missile guards at several widely separated missile sites over hundreds of square miles. I mean, just K1 is very far away from L1 and so on. And yet simultaneously, just one after the other, guards are saying, we're seeing strange objects above our missile site. And they're using the term object repeatedly. These guards are trained in aircraft identification. They need to know if an aircraft, civilian aircraft, strays from its flight path and gets over this restricted airspace where the missiles are, they need to be able to report to their commanders. It's a commercial aircraft, a Boeing whatever, 707. So they're trained in aircraft identification. They know military aircraft identification. And yet in every case, they do not recognize what they're seeing. These objects are unlike anything they've ever been trained to identify and report. And even though these objects seem to be quite real and simultaneously being reported, initially there was no evidence that they were there as far as radar confirmation. That changes, we'll see here shortly. Next slide, please. The next entry, a security camper team. When missile maintenance teams have to stay out at a missile site overnight to repair it, they have a security team with them who stay in a camper, what you would call a caravan, very small caravan, 2-man. And this security camper team at missile site K4 reported UFO, they used the term for the first time, other than the word object, with white lights, one red light 50 yards behind white light, personnel at K1 seeing same object. So you have two widely separated teams of security personnel reporting independently. They are looking at this object that has this particular description. Next slide, please. Finally, height finder radar, which measures an object's altitude as opposed to its position relative to the radar installation. Height finding radar personnel picked up these objects, and it says that there was as many, at 10 to 13,000 feet in altitude, as many as 7, and as few as 2. They would intermittently increase or decrease in numbers, what was being tracked. Then it says stationary, meaning the objects were hovering, /7 knots, that's 9 miles per hour. The object just began moving around the sky very slowly, walking distance. You could have kept up with it if you were up at that altitude. And then, just moving around very slowly. Next slide, please. Okay, a second radar tracking. This is from SAC command post. Called and advised that SAC crews at sites L1, L6, and M1 observing UFO. Object yellowish bright brown light 20 miles north of Harleton. It then says 2 to 4,000 feet, confirming that the height finder radar was picking this object up as it maneuvered between 2,000 and 4,000 feet in altitude above the Earth. That's very important because it verifies that what these guards were observing was not some phenomenon high out in space, such as meteors, not something high in the atmosphere like the aurora borealis, the northern lights, but indeed was a craft generating a radar return just as any aircraft would, and was maneuvering between 2,000 and 4,000 feet. Next slide, please. Oops, we skipped 2 or 3 slides. Let's go back, if we can do that possibly. Go back one more, if possible. Okay, this is an entry. Somehow when he's hitting advance, it's going ahead more than one slide, so that's okay, no biggie. All right, this one says from SAC command post, missile site L5 reported object increased in speed, high velocity, raised in altitude, and now cannot tell the object from the stars. Moments earlier, these objects were just maneuvering around at walking speed. Now, suddenly one of them is zipping very high in altitude at a very high rate of speed. So quite clearly, these are not conventional aircraft. They can hover, they can move very slowly in the sky, and they can also suddenly move away at high velocity. Next slide, please. And that's the one I read earlier, so let's go to the next one. Nope, it went ahead 2. Let's go back 1. Okay, this is the last one. That was it right there. Just ahead, one more, I think, is where you want to go. Nope. Somehow it's skipping. That was it. Yeah. There you go. Okay, this is the last one that I'll read from this document. It says, SAC command post reports UFO 20 miles southeast of Lewistown, orange, white, disc object, a flying saucer. So the Pentagon, meanwhile, is saying they don't exist. Don't worry about it, American people. You know, it's a figment of your imagination. Meanwhile, what you have flying around America's nuclear weapons sites are flying saucers. And quite clearly, the public has been kept in the dark about this. Now, I'm going to speak a little bit about this, so we don't want to advance right now. What the documents don't say, and again, these are released through the Freedom of Information Act, but what has emerged from witness testimony, nuclear missile launch officers, targeting officers, missile maintenance personnel who I have interviewed have said to me and have said to the American people. We held a press conference on September 27th, 2010. CNN streamed it live. If you go to my website, ufohastings.com, on the homepage, there is a 63-minute video of CNN's live coverage, live streaming of my press conference. You will see 7 Air Force officers retired, most of whom were nuclear missile launch officers or targeting officers, talking about these incidents. What the documents do not say, because it is so sensitive, And the information is considered so highly classified that it can be kept secret even though this law, the Freedom of Information Act, exists. What the officers say, and have said on camera in this press conference, is that on some occasions, when these disc-shaped craft are near the missiles, hovering over the missiles, flying around the missiles malfunction. They drop off alert status. I've had repeatedly launch officers down in the capsule, 60 feet underground. One usually sleeps, the other's at the console. They say they get a telephone call from their guard at topside, the head guard, he's called a flight security controller, screaming into the phone. What is this? What is this? There's an object hovering over our missiles. All these officers say to me, I was about to ask this guy what he'd been drinking. You know, are you doing drugs? Are you smoking dope? And before I could get the words out of my mouth, my missiles began malfunctioning, what's called dropping off alert status. On their consoles, they see green lights, they see all the missiles are ready to launch if the President of the United States orders the launch of nuclear missiles. Suddenly, the green lights turn to red, one after the other, all 10, where even if the President, and the cases that I'm talking about, it would have been Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, if he had called SAC and said, launch World War III, these 10 missiles would have gone nowhere. They were just in the ground, just like metal, junk metal. So when they investigated and found what the problem was, the entire hardware system in what's called the GNC, guidance and control systems, were fried. Basically, the entire hardware had to be removed and replaced because the circuitry was inoperable. And Boeing Corporation, which is the main Minuteman contractor, investigated these cases at Malmstrom in March of '67, and the only way they could replicate this defect was to direct a high-level energy pulse directly into these 10 cables, underground cables linking the launch control facility to the missiles. By directly touching the cable and injecting what's called a square wave into the system, you could create this type of failure. But Boeing could prove that that was probably what went on, but they could not say what simultaneously would have been able to access these underground 10 cables within a matter of seconds to create this problem. But at the same time this was occurring, Bob Salas, Captain Robert Salas, who co-sponsored the press conference with me, his guard was screaming into the phone that there was a saucer-shaped, glowing red object, illuminated, surrounded by, enveloped in plasma, orangish plasma, hovering right above the launch control facility. At the same time, his missiles began malfunctioning. Now, even though the only official Air Force group that would have investigated UFOs was Project Blue Book, Captain Salas said that they were interrogated, debriefed is the more polite word, by OSI agents, Office of Special Investigations agents. They were asked what occurred. The agent wrote that down. They were then sworn to secrecy and said that if you talk about this, you can be subject to 10 years in jail and a $10,000 fine. Captain Salas, this was in March 25th, 1967. Captain Salas kept quiet about this until the mid-1990s. Long story short, he read an excerpt from Mr. Good's book, Above Top Secret, mentioning a case at Malmstrom, and he thought that was his case. It turned out to be another event 8 days earlier, but Mr. Salas felt that this was his case, and he decided to begin speaking about this publicly. He went on television programs to talk about this happening. Again, this was 1995. At this point, we know we have the testimony of nuclear missile launch officers or targeting officers or missile maintenance personnel from every American nuclear missile base saying to me, this happened at my base. And the same thing went on. We were sworn to secrecy. We were told never to talk about this. Many of these people are, even today, I mean, they're in their 70s and 80s. They say, did I do the right thing about talking about this? My government told me never to talk about it. They have an anguish in their soul. Did I do the right thing by going public and talking about this? They're very reluctant to talk about it. And yet, 7 of the 140 or so that I've now interviewed decided to participate in this press conference 3 years ago and tell the world that this was real, that this was going on, and that they were present when this occurred. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, there was a period in the early 1990s where former Soviet military personnel became available for interviews. Western journalists, Western researchers went to Moscow and other places in the former Soviet Union to interview people who were involved in the military in the Soviet Union. A reporter in Las Vegas, a journalist named George Knapp, interviewed several people, got KGB documents, the American, the Russian CIA in effect, KGB documents talking about UFO activity at Soviet missile sites, Soviet Ministry of Defense documents talking about UFO activity at Soviet missile sites, and interviewed on videotape he and other Western journalists. In America, we have ABC, the American Broadcasting Company. In 1994, October 5th, they ran a program on American TV in which they had video footage of several, 4 or 5 Soviet military veterans who were talking about UFO activity at their missile sites during the Cold War era. In one case, in October of 1982 at a Soviet missile base in Ukraine, according to these witnesses, according to the documents that are now available, I have some of them posted at my website, an object considered a disc in shape, the size of a 5-story building, the witnesses said, hovered at such a high altitude above this one missile base that even anti-aircraft rockets could not reach it. Jets could not fly at that altitude. And it was up there for approximately 2 hours, safe because it was so high up. According to the witnesses, including launch personnel, targeting personnel who have now been interviewed and talked publicly, they say that suddenly down in the launch control capsule, some unspecified number of missiles suddenly activated and were preparing to launch. They were going through the countdown sequence for 15 seconds. And at the end, one of the witnesses said, our hair was turning white. We knew that these missiles were about to launch. Moscow did not order the launch. We did not put the targeting codes in, and suddenly these missiles were activating and going 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And we were running around like chickens with our heads cut off. We were scared to death. And after 15 seconds, everything returned to normal. They took apart the equipment, could find no problems, no errors. All of this is in KGB and Ministry of Defense reports that if you read Russian, you can read as well as I can read. So I had one of my people, he just passed away on the 31st of May, Captain David Shore, Air Force Missile Launch Officer. He said at Minot Air Force Base, North Dakota, in the summer of '66, couldn't remember the date, his missiles were activated. He gets a call that guards up at ground level are observing a bright object moving from missile to missile to missile. And as it moves and hovers above a given missile, that missile on his launch readiness console lights up and is going through its countdown, activated, just like in Russia. 10, 9, 8. And what they did in North Dakota was turn actually what's called the inhibit switch to stop this missile from being launched. David Shore said this went on to, he thought, perhaps 6 or 7 or 8 of his 10 missiles. Then it moved on to another group of 10 missiles, and he could hear over this communication system called PASS, Primary Alert System, that the same thing was happening at another flight of missiles many miles away. And they're freaking out. They don't know what this is all about. So they're not trained for anything like this. They get back to the base the next day, David Shore and his deputy commander. The operations officer of the squadron says to them, they think they're going to ask us 100 questions about this, let's prepare ourselves, They get in there and the operations officer said, nothing to discuss, nothing to talk about among yourselves, don't do it, go home. So David Shore believes that other groups of officers came in earlier that day. You drive in from this missile site. other teams who came early who reported to the operations officer what exactly had occurred. So by the time they arrived from their very distant missile site, the people, the intelligence people already knew what had happened, and they did not need to hear the story again and again and again. David Shore was one of those people who came to me in 2007. He said, I've known about your work since 2002, but I felt that I would get in trouble even though I'm retired. I felt that the FBI would knock on my door and say, you talked to Robert Hastings about this, you're in deep trouble. He said, I was afraid for 5 years that something like that would happen, but I finally felt that the American people deserve to know the truth. And so he allowed me to be interviewed on tape in 2000, himself to be interviewed on tape in 2007. So, what I am able to conclude at this point is that at least beginning in the 1940s, whoever they are have been around here probably for hundreds or thousands of years, but certainly since the 1940s, when nuclear weapons were invented, began to be tested and deployed, suddenly UFO activity worldwide went just upward, just kept going up and up. And it's quite clear from the documents and the witness testimony, one of the things that's going on, whoever they are, wherever they're from, however they get here, whatever their overall plan is, part of what they're up to is monitoring and sometimes tampering with American and Russian nuclear weapons. And we can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, I think. Next slide, please. Now, there are many people in the world who are skeptical of all of this. That's fine. There is, of course, a difference between having an opinion and having an informed opinion. Most of the skeptics say this can't be real. There are other explanations. You know, this is all nonsense. People like me are in this for the money. We like the spotlight. We like to see ourselves on TV. I have a friend in the back row here who knows I live in the middle of nowhere in Colorado and have antelope for neighbors, not even humans. I don't need the spotlight. I'm driving a 23-year-old Honda. I'm not making a lot of money on this. And yet I feel it's important to talk about this. But skepticism is good, as long as the skeptics do their homework, and when they speak, they know what they're talking about instead of just topping off the top of their head. Now, there is a leading group in America called the Committee, well, you can read it. It used to be called PSYCOP. They've changed their name now to CSI, Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And they supposedly deal with UFOs in a very rigorous, scientific, rational fashion. Not, okay? They published this magazine called Skeptical Inquirer. The editor of the magazine is Kendrick Frazier. If you go to the publisher's page in every issue of that magazine, Kendrick Frazier is listed as a science writer, quote unquote. That's his profession, according to this magazine. I made it my business to find out who this guy was, why he was out to debunk UFOs and say bad things about people who reported them. Next slide, please. In one interview, okay, we skipped by it, never mind, that's fine. What Kendrick Frazier said was basically people like myself don't know what we're talking about, we exaggerate what the documents say and so on. Well, what I found out, Mr. Frazier, who does write books about science, so he is a science writer, for the 22 years he was debunking UFOs and saying this is all nonsense. He was working as a public relations specialist for the second most important nuclear weapons lab in the United States, Sandia Labs. You can look high and low in that damn magazine and you will not find a reference to that. Gee, what a coincidence. You have all these documents and all these military people saying, you know, UFOs shut down my nuclear weapons. Who's the magazine? Who's the group of, quote, skeptics who are saying this is all nonsense? Well, one of them, the leader, the publisher of their magazine, the editor I should say, works for the US government's nuclear weapons program as a PR, public relations mouthpiece. Probably a coincidence, probably not meaningful at all, right? Next slide, please. Okay, one last document. This was released by the FBI to a physicist named Dr. Bruce Maccabee in 1977, I believe, maybe 78. It's authentic. It's now actually at the FBI's website. If you go to the website and go to their documents page and type in, let's say, Hotel, H-O-T-T-E-L, that was the special agent who wrote this. If you go to the document search, type in Hotel, this will appear on your screen. It's dated March 22nd, 1950. It was sent to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. When this document was released through the Freedom of Information Act, the names of individuals were redacted, censored, ostensibly for their privacy. And what this says is, quote, the following information was furnished to special agent by whoever. An investigator for the Air Force has stated that 3 so-called flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. They were described as being circular in shape with raised centers approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of human shape but only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body was bandaged in a manner similar to the blackout suits used by speed flyers and test pilots. According to Mr. Whoever's informant, the saucers were found in New Mexico due to the fact that the government has a very high-powered radar setup in that area, and it is believed that the radar interferes with the controlling mechanism of the saucers. No further evaluation was attempted by Special Agent Whoever concerning the above. Now, there's a good bit of speculation and controversy about what this represents, what case they're talking about, whether this is real. In my opinion, the information is so vague that you really can't say it relates to this case or that case. It clearly, based on the date and the description of the events, the alleged events, if you prefer, this was not talking about Roswell, which occurred 3 years earlier and did not involve 3 craft, did not involve 9 bodies and so on. So there's speculation that this was relating to what is called the Aztec case, which Mr. Good mentioned, which occurred in 1948 in northern New Mexico, another alleged crash, if you prefer. But to be honest, there's controversy even within the group of people who are studying this, who have different opinions about what this is referring to. So what I tell my audiences is this: what we can prove is that on March 22nd, 1950, the highest figure in the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, was told that the US government had crashed flying saucers and the bodies of the crew. That's all one can say with any certainty in my view. Now, I earlier briefly discussed Roswell and the fact that at the time of the alleged crash in July of '47, it took place not far from the world's only atomic bomber base, Roswell Army Airfield, an interesting nuclear weapons link. There is a retired, he's now deceased, he died in 2005, Air Force Brigadier General Arthur E. Exon, E-X-O-N. If you Google his name, you'll see that he's given verbal and written statements to researchers since 1990, in which he said he was at Wright Field when it was an Army airfield in 1947, later became Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was engaged in a 2-year aeronautical engineering program at Wright Field. And suddenly there was this flurry of rumors and reports that a plane load of debris had been flown in from New Mexico of the crash object. And what is this? There's all these rumors about this is very strange material and so on. Hours earlier, the chief of the 8th Air Force, General Roger Ramey, told the public that this was simply a misidentified weather balloon. After the report came out saying a crashed flying saucer had been recovered, General Ramey holds this press conference very quickly and said, sorry, these people didn't know what they were seeing. It's just weather balloon debris. Here's some of it for you to look at and photograph. Well, Colonel Jesse Marcel, who retired as a colonel, who was the one who brought that real debris back to Roswell Army Airfield, says that he was called aside before the reporters got to that room and said, you will say this was a weather balloon. General Dubose was mentioned by Tim Good. He was the person who said, yes, that was a story for the media, that this was a weather balloon. Meanwhile, the real wreckage was being flown to Wright Field, which is what General Exon confirms. General Exon says he only saw what apparently was, there was a crash site the debris field that everyone's heard about, all this debris, metallic debris. But he said he flew over it and he saw a 500-foot gouge in the desert floor where this thing had hit ground, scraped along the desert floor, and then became airborne again. Finally crashing about 30 miles to the east or just north of Roswell, New Mexico itself. General Exxon said he was not directly involved in the analysis of this material at Wright Field, but he was in direct touch with people who were, and he said within 24 hours, we knew we had a craft from space. General Exxon, upon retiring and speaking to the researchers in the late 80s and early 90s, has said within 24 hours, everyone from President Truman on down knew this was a craft from space. And he's referred to it in writing and in audio interviews as a, quote, spacecraft or a craft from space. General Exxon further said, in 1962 to 66, I believe are the correct dates, he was actually the base commander of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as you know, a higher ranking officer. He said there were some occasions, he didn't specify when or how many, where a call would come from the Pentagon saying we're sending a recovery team to Wright Field. They will be involved with UFO related operation. You are to supply them with a logistical support, but that's all, you know, we can tell you. And General Exxon said that's all he knew, but in fact there appeared to be multiple crashes as time went on in the early 60s that he was told to support the groups that were going out to the field to do the recoveries. Now, I think one has to ask oneself why a retired Air Force general would go out on the public record and say these things if they were not true. I mean, what would he have to gain? He didn't make any money on it. Skeptics who think UFOs are nonsense have ridiculed him. Most people don't like to be ridiculed. So he had nothing to gain and everything to lose by admitting this, and yet he has now publicly said this was the case. In my country, there was a man named Senator Barry Goldwater. He ran for the Republican Party for the presidential position in 1964. He ran against Lyndon Johnson. He was very right-wing, very conservative. He talked about us needing to bomb the Soviets from time to time, you know, and most Americans went, ugh, we don't need that. So he lost the election. But Senator Barry Goldwater, beginning in the late 70s, I've got letters that he wrote to researchers. They written to him and said, what do you know about UFOs? And in these letters he says, I heard about a facility at Wright-Patterson called the Blue Room, in which allegedly was the absolute physical evidence, the proof of UFOs being from somewhere else. That was the clear implication. He finally went on Larry King. Most of you, I think, know Larry King on CNN. And he has a radio show as well as a television show. And in 1979, Senator Goldwater, who was also an Air Force general in the reserve, went on Larry King's radio program and admitted that, yes, he had written to these researchers and told them that he had attempted year after year, or over several years, many times, to gain access to the Blue Room. He had top secret clearances. He worked with the Intelligence Oversight Committee in the United States Senate. He had top secret clearances for any number of things. He was an Air Force general in the reserve. He said one of the generals, one of the chiefs of staff of the Air Force he asked for access to the Blue Room was General Curtis LeMay, who was our leading bombing strategist during World War II, bombing Japan and so on. And he was later chief of staff of the Air Force. Goldwater said when he asked General LeMay if he could get access to the Blue Room, LeMay said to him, quote, hell no, you can't go, I can't go, don't ask me again. So, now, again, I ask, what does Senator Goldwater have to gain by going public with that story? He didn't make any money off it. You know, half the people who heard it thought he was a nut, you know. What did he have to gain? And yet he said this happened. I heard these rumors. And he said, logically enough, because I didn't get in, I can't tell you what's in there. But clearly his sources that he heard rumors from said, yeah, that's where the craft is, that's where the bodies are. And you know, if you can get in there, you have physical evidence that these are beings from some other world. So, I don't know why I am so driven to do what I do. I jokingly say I blame it on the implant. But I wake up thinking about this, I go to bed thinking about this, and as long as I can function, I'm 63, I plan to seek out these military witnesses and interview them. And I am working on a film, hopefully within a year it'll be out, called UFOs and Nukes, just like my book. My book is available at my website. It has taped interviews with nearly 100 of my witnesses and other documentation. If you go to my website, you can read on the documents page all of the documents that I've shown you here and many others. I think this is very important that people should know about this. I do not believe that my government or any government is going to lead the way by releasing this information. I think whoever they are going to at some point do something so spectacular around the world that nobody will be able to deny the existence of UFOs. My opinion, I have no idea. But what I have chosen to do is educate people on a take it or leave it basis. If you think what I say has merit, great, go to my website. If you think this is nonsense, great, I could care less. But I don't engage in debates with skeptics unless they can prove to me that they've done their homework. What witnesses have they interviewed? What documents have they reviewed and can speak about knowledgeably? What scientific credentials do they have that were directly applied to research of UFOs, not some theoretical armchair, hypothesizing, but have they done the work? If I have someone who is skeptical, who has done the work, and can knowledgeably support their skeptical position, I love to talk to those people. Unfortunately, 1 out of 100 skeptics are in that position. The other ones are your classic shoot from the lip armchair experts. They have all the facts, or all the answers, I should say, even though they've studied none of the facts. So, I guess I've become a grumpy old man because that's my attitude. So, thank you very much. I understand we're going to have a question and answer session with Mr. Good and myself later today.
Great.